This episode is brought to you by LaFosse Academy, a program dedicated to helping people from diverse backgrounds break into the tech industry. They don't just train you with the skills you need, they help you to land your first role, give you real-world experience and a strong foundation to launch your career in tech. For businesses, the Academy offers a way to build diverse, future-ready teams while creating opportunities for talented individuals who might not have had a traditional route into tech. So, whether you're looking to start a career in tech or you're a business leader ready to build a stronger, more diverse team, speak to LaFosse Academy and take the next step. At Elevate Colour, we're proud to share their mission to level the playing field and create a tech workforce that truly reflects society. Hi everyone, welcome back to Race to the Top with me, Oki Lazi. My guest today is legendary filmmaker Charles Burnett. We have a very wide-ranging conversation on many topics, more about his life than the films, and we talk about things like literally growing up in the early 50s and 60s, living through the civil rights movement in LA rather than in the South, living in a very segmented and segregated world, spending most of his youth basically trying to stay out of trouble, and the fact that even still today, it sometimes feels like they're still fighting a civil war. It was an incredibly enlightening conversation that was inspirational too. I found it very inspirational. I hope you do too. Let's get into it. It's a terrific honour to have you on and to hear about you, your life, and your views.
Thank you.
So on this podcast, we like to start at the beginning. And so I'm really interested, and actually, just quickly to say, you're the first person we've had on from the States. So this is, again, a really great and interesting shift for us and our listeners. And to have a real slightly different view, and hopefully we'll be able to compare and contrast what's going on with racial equity in the US and the UK. You know, the US is actually probably much more talked about and documented. So I think that should be really interesting for us too. So with that, could you tell me what was it like growing up in LA, right? LA is where you grew up?
Yes.
What was that like? And, you know, when about, so that would have been the early 60s?
50s and 60s, yeah.
50s, 60s, yeah.
50s and 60s, yes. What was it like?
Yeah.
It was a fun place. I mean, it was a very exciting place because there were a lot of the things that were going on. You know, there, like music was a big issue. I mean, a big thing here. You know, there are a lot of jazz clubs here, a lot of just local clubs in the neighborhood. There were, even though it was a segregated community, very, Hispanic and Black, but it was still an enjoyable place because there were a lot of good things for a kid to do. You know, it was during the civil rights movement, so we had this feeling that we were supposed to be a part of making a better life, part of social change. Everything was basically about raising people's consciousness about what, history and there were Black History Month and all that sort of thing came about, during this period. And so there was a lot of looking back at the past and how we got here. And in my particular case, my parents were from the South. And I'm from there, but I grew up in LA, of course. And so there was always this discussion about what the South was like. So the South was sort of a mystery to me and very magical.
Yeah.
And my mother and they would talk about how they hated it and they would never go back and things like that. And so it had this strange effect on me in many ways. Anyway, yeah, but we had, I mean, LA was sort of undeveloped, and so there were a lot of empty spaces here and a lot of places where you take your bike. We just went all over LA on our bikes, and did a whole bunch of things. I raised pigeons and all sorts of things. My grandmother and had, chickens and turkeys and rabbits and things like that. So we and she had a garden, and so we sort of like took care of growing our own food, and so it was a pleasant place to be.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned the civil rights movement is something that people of my generation, and especially in this country, can read about, and it's much dramatized, especially in film, much talked about. What was it actually like being around at that time? I mean, was it a hopeful time? What was it? What was that like?
Well, it was uh, yeah, it was very hopeful because I mean, young people were involved in the movement. You know, at least LA, there wasn't bus boycotts or sit-ins or anything like that. That was more Southern experience.
Yeah,
Here, it was like um, just trying to inch more and more toward a diverse community because where I lived, it was segregated, it was blocked off. I mean, it was like Central Avenue and places like that where we what was big in the neighborhood. And like where I live, you couldn't cross uh, San Pedro at one point. Then you couldn't cross Main. You couldn't cross Broadway. You had to stay on that side of the tracks, so to speak.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
And so we sort of like encroached upon the white neighborhoods little by little. It wasn't until they had these developments outside of Los Angeles, like Diamond Bar and way in Fountain Valley and places like that, where they opened these new communities that that, that white people could separate themselves from black folks. And so that's made the ghetto even more black in a sense, because what used to be where we used to rub elbows with people, now they were moved miles and miles away and left the community left the community for black people, in the sense that the housing development, what they did was very interesting. They would uh, um, invite, the areas were basically all white. You couldn't move into these areas, but what they would do is allow one black person to move in, and then all of a sudden the white people start scattering about and going, leaving, and so the real estate start, you know, being sold. People start making money that way. And so it was economic things that really helped out in many ways to get into these neighborhoods. Where I live now, and in Baldwin Hills area and View Park area, you couldn't sell to a black person. The house and in the deed it said you have to sell to a white person.
Oh
You
wow, in
know,
the deeds.
yeah, the deed, and then like uh, Inglewood, which was near the airport where I live, was a town they call sundowner towns, where black people had to be out at a certain hour in the evenings. You can come there and work, but you had to leave. And like Beverly Hills, of course, was that, and San Gabriel, all these places where sundowner towns where you can come in, but you had to leave. And that's why they call them sundowner towns. You had to be out by
Oh,
sundown. And so uh, that sort of changed a bit when people started moving back. Well, it was interesting because when it was a sense of, it wasn't a gas crisis, people moved way out, but when there was a gas crisis, they had to find that it was more expensive living way out there than driving back into town. So then the started coming back
yeah.
to the community. So it was a back and forth kind of situation. And of course, the police were totally terrorists and things like that, and they hired um, white police officers from the South to sort of police the area, because they figured that they knew how to handle black people. And so it was a lot of contradictions in the community.
Yeah.
It was, you know,
And it's often portrayed as a time of, well, which it was, mass oppression. But once you were there as a young person, was it still uh, fun? And you spent time. I mean, obviously deeply segregated, but clearly in your segregated area, you could relax, have fun, grow up, be a happy kind of young person.
yeah, it was a very entertaining and fun place. And I used to play a trumpet in the band and things
Oh
like that.
wow.
And so a lot of things to do. I raised pigeons. We would go almost ride our bikes everywhere. It, uh, and there was a ranch further down near Compton that we used to go down and work on the ranch and clean out the stalls and ride the horses free. We're not free, but we work for it. And so my brother had a horse, and so did some of my neighbors, and so it was sort of like it was really country in many ways.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Uh,
And how
but
was school?
school was awful. The No, they were. Honestly, I didn't even know why I was going to school, really. I mean, it wasn't like, it was. I mean, one of the teachers when we were at junior high school um, didn't really think we were going to be much, and so he one day came down the class, the aisle of the classroom, and pointed out to students and said, "You're not going to be anything, and you're not going to be anything, and you're not." And we got to me, he said, "You're not going to be anything." And that really sort of bothered me for a very long time. It was that kind of discouragement.
Was,
Uh,
was this you're not going to be anything on the basis of the color of your skin or the effort that you're putting in school?
it was the schools were segregated. They were all black or Hispanic or something, but the quality was very bad. They didn't expect you to be anything, so they didn't teach you. They didn't care about your your accomplishments or anything like that. I got some of the bad advice at that moment. I was told that I took art class then, and I remember the teacher said Egyptians can't draw.
What?
They can't. Yeah, they because they only saw these hieroglyphic figures,
Oh, all
and
right.
one-dimensional, two-dimensional figures. And so I've always had this feeling from that point on that Egyptians and Africans couldn't draw, and so it wasn't until when I went to Egypt that I was so angry at the fact that I saw such great art. I saw the pyramids, I saw, statues and just some profound things that beat the Parthenon, in many ways. And I was so disappointed that I was brainwashed by these teachers that said, Egyptians couldn't draw, therefore Africans couldn't draw. And so that was a discovery for me. It was the fact that I realized people had lied to us, and that we had this feeling that also that we couldn't accomplish anything. I mean, history, it wasn't until later that Black history studies came about, and Black studies and things like that, when we became aware, when there were classes dealing with the history of Black and all walks of life.
Yeah,
And now they're trying to go back, and this administration and this and these officials trying to deny who we were as people, and ban books that would sort of like explain and document that we were an integral part of building America.
yeah,
We had great people in our history. Frederick Douglass, Ida B. Wells. You can go on and on and on. It wasn't until I got in college that because Black history wasn't really taught until later. Until I learned on my own who these people were. And I was so disappointed in the fact that that would have made a big difference in my life, and I know the kids in my neighborhood would have had that to lean on, people to sort of model themselves after,
yeah, yeah.
and some really great heroes that we would have really benefited from knowing.
So where did you get your motivation from to become this sort of great storyteller? Because I mean, you didn't have um, so you didn't have role models ahead of you that suggested that you could go and do what you've gone on to do. So how did you find the motivation to do that?
Well, I think looking at the people that came from the South were very principled and uh, um, they had ideas of what it was to be a man, a woman, and to be responsible. You had a family, you're supposed to do certain things and have certain things um, that we was concerned uh, about making life better for other people. And I remember the older men in my neighborhood, they would say, encourage you by saying, boy, stay in school and you get a diploma, and like, that was from the working class. Now, there was middle class is that when before the uh, before integration.
Hmm.
Uh, Black people had businesses and barbershops, all sorts of things, businesses. Watts was a little town in many ways. And so you would go to downtown Watts and you see people who had stores and things like that. You hear about Black Wall Street, all of that, where people had ideas of contributing and having their own community and schools and things like that. And then, if you look at the history of it, it was all taken away and destroyed. And so there's always been this battle of people trying to, people, I mean, this, unfortunately, white people tried to kill the competition. This is what Ida B. Wells, because she was fighting for anti anti-lynching. She was a journalist, and fighting anti-lynching. I mean, fighting lynching, and because a lot of these people a lot of Black people were lynched because they were in competition with white businesses, in the South, and so they suffered because of the competition, and it was discouraging. It was this sort of terroristic attitude about keeping people down, and one way to keep them down was economically uh, take advantage of it, and make it very difficult for them to make a living.
Yeah, yeah. So
But people, I'm sorry,
I
but
was
people
gonna,
were very, I'm sorry, go ahead.
no, no, please do. This long distance call.
No, no. I was saying that one of the things that was very helpful was that there were people who, when the people who moved from the South, and the first wave of people from the South were people who got away from slavery,
Mm,
and came to Detroit, went to Detroit and Chicago and all those places, and later people came to Los Angeles because of the war and stuff, and being um, you know, drafted into the army and came to Los Angeles for training and so that's where that movement where we came from. All the people in my neighborhood um, were born in the South. Everyone from Texas, Arkansas, Alabama, you name it. It was basically a Southern atmospheric situation in town. You
right.
know, and so we never really left the South. All that came with us. Uh, but it was just like being in the South. I mean, it was just as racist in many ways, and and just it was, you know, we understood, like I said, we understood where we were, and that there was no community that was like a capsule of people who managed to make a living in these horrible situations in Los Angeles. I mean, it was good in many ways because they didn't have this sort of same kind of uh, racism that they had in the South. It was still there, but it was more liberal in a way, and you had the illusion that you were better off,
Yeah,
and it wasn't because it was economically you were getting paid less still, you know. Your schools were not as good and things. In some ways, the South had it better because they had a history of teaching, about the past. Um, I think we're in the North sort of thought we had it easy, but with reality, I think the Southerners had it better
yeah,
in some way.
and I suppose for them in the South it was life and death, with lynching and things like that, whereas that was less prevalent in the North.
It was less, but it was still hostile. We never felt that we belonged, as I said. I mean, there was a working class and there was a middle class. The middle class came with aspirations of accomplishing something, becoming lawyers. See, I was telling you earlier that these older gentlemen would say, stay in school, were families that had more or less a middle class background, and parents who were business oriented had an advantage because their kids like understood what education was about, and they were told directly, like going get an education. They became lawyers and business people and things like that. Where we were like the kids I grew up with were not that aware of the importance of education, and so a lot of them just fell victim to the sort of uh, 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 the victim to the sort of racist policies and the lack of really understanding what education was about, and got involved in a lot of trouble and things, and end up, falling victim to like jails, and things like that, and finding that it was more um, 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 this whole thing of becoming criminalized
Yeah.
by by the fact of this was expected of you, and made it very difficult for you to go to jail. And because when I was coming up, a lot of the kids were very talented in track and sports and whatever it is. It could have been, you know, a good citizens. In fact, they accomplished things. And in spite of all of that, a lot of them did. I discovered that there were a lot of people who came from that sort of background of, missing a lot of things that were could have been very helpful to them, still ended up, in spite of everything, very accomplished.
Yeah.
A lot of them became principals of schools and things, and
Wow.
in government and in business people. And when I look around, I was quite surprised at the number of kids that I find are doing quite well in spite of everything. But that's always been the case where you had to do better, surprisingly. You
Yeah.
know,
So
it's like
so what did
I'm sorry.
your first of all, what did your parents want you to be? And then I suppose secondarily, what did they tell you you'd have to do to achieve that?
No, my parents just wanted us to stay out of trouble. That was the main thing. Stay out of trouble and just be uh, get a decent job, but not, my my uh, my grandmother was very active in the church, and 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 because I have a kind of cousin who was a preacher in Mississippi, and we would go back and in this church and pray all day long every day until we got religion and everything. And the idea was that money was evil. That was the bad part of my grandma coming up, was thinking that money was evil, and you really didn't want to make a lot of money, because people who were rich were not very happy. So I had this really strange idea uh, coming up, and not very motivated because of that. And most of the kids were like that as well. They came up with a point where they rejected a lot of the things that their parents were doing. Like my mother worked at a hospital. She was a nurse's maid. She would get up at 4 o'clock in the morning and go to work and come home and work, and go to bed and get up and go to work. It was that kind of lifestyle.
Yeah.
She didn't have any hobbies or anything, but it was this that uh, it wasn't very a fun life, because always when she was in the South, she worked, but she went to Catholic school, but she got a decent education, surprisingly. And but uh, and I think that group that came were more motivated about being responsible people, because we had in our neighborhood, it wasn't exactly in Watts, but it was pretty close to Watts. It was about a mile away from Watts, officially Watts.
Hmm.
And so most of the people had bought houses because it was relatively cheap to buy a house, like $15,000 would get you a decent house in South Central. Uh, and you could work at a menial job and still live in a relatively good apartment and a house,
Yeah.
and it was affordable. But not now. It's not. The houses in Watts, like with 15 to 20,000 dollars, are going now for $400,000 and up. So it's got inflation has created a lot of serious uh, uh, things that we used to be able to afford, to can't afford. And I'm always surprised at what the houses would cost. Yeah. And so
Yeah.
it made it very difficult. I mean, you could I mean, you can go down at Grand Central Market and buy food and fruits and stuff and meat at a really, really, really low price, you know. But now it's just like it's outrageous.
Yeah, no,
Yeah,
I think we have that same problem everywhere. Where, in especially gentrification, definitely in the UK, where areas where there were predominantly black people in London, um,
yeah,
in the 60s and 70s, now those places, if you're able to hang on to your property, it's worth a lot of money now. But most people haven't, and they've moved out into different areas. Those areas have become gentrified. Sounds like very similar there.
yeah. You have to move back to the South to find anything cheaper. But then if you sell your house here, yeah, you make a lot of money, but you can't afford to buy you know, a house, even though you made a lot on the houses you paid $20,000 for, 15 or whatever it is. But it's outrageous. And you see more people living on the streets in LA and any place in America now. It's just unheard of. I mean, we used to see homeless people like very rarely, and it was
Yeah,
like that they were called hobos or bums, and they were like romantic figures that you sort of idolize to some extent, because they had this this we attributed that they had this sense of freedom, you know, and they would be on the railroad tracks walking to whatever, hopping a train. But now you see families, you see kids out on the street living on cardboard boxes on the street, and no work, and I mean, it's just awful. And that's what America's become. It's like it's rich and poor,
yeah,
and I mean, and you find them everywhere. They they sort of habit Beverly Hills, on the streets in Beverly Hills and all these places where I don't know. There seemed to be no way of correcting and going back to where there was a state where people could make a living. I mean, if you don't have medical insurance here, it's impossible to to sort of live uh, without falling trapped to costs and so forth.
yeah,
I mean, strange enough, I don't want to romanticize Europe, but when I was in Argentina, Africa, and places like that in Europe, when I went to the doctor, they didn't ask you for uh, insurance. Like
insurance
it's
details. Yeah,
like in America, you can't even go to a doctor without or a pharmacy and asking for medication or whatever it is without getting ripped off by saying, well, you have to go see a doctor if you want to get a prescription. Then you have to pay the doctor. Then you have to come back and pay a higher price for the prescription, and it's just impossible.
yeah, no,
And so you say, how can you live?
yeah.
It's
It's very difficult. So it sounds to me like you had this upbringing where your parents said the primary thing was stay out of trouble,
yeah.
and stay in school. Is there anything else that you're thankful that your parents taught you when you were young?
Well, yeah, I think they told me how to respect people, live and let live,
Yeah,
you know, and uh, uh, and you know better than anybody else and know worse, and so um, it you had that, that you didn't look down on people, and the whole idea was to because from the south in the south, people was family with a sense of there was sort of an idea that uh, that you had to help people. Like if there was a funeral or something, we all chipped in. We are all there, and there was this attitude of of understanding someone else's pain. You know, and like if for example, one of the things I learned too was when say for example if um, we were having dinner or something, and some friends came over, some male friends or whatever it is, adults come over, and my mother would say, "Well, fix yourself a plate," and they would say, "He was talking about men and women, whatever." Would say no. They would say no. Let the kids eat first.
mm.
You know, it was always this respect and understanding that you know that there was this custom, you know, and so I learned that and that adults had a sort of humane approach to life, that they got so they developed and learned that in the South, coming from from these southern states
Yeah.
and things.
So
That was really good.
so understand that. So at what point did you realize that you either wanted or had the capability to be a filmmaker?
When did I realize I didn't have the
Or you did that you could be a filmmaker?
oh, that's the funny thing. because I grew up in this area where that didn't exist,
Yeah.
you know. And so but the still photography did, and I wanted to be a still photographer, a journalist, a photojournalist at one point. But I had majored in electronics, so I was sort of drifting toward electronics because I was very good in it.
Yeah.
And although when I went to City College, there was an opportunity to take still photography, but I didn't because I didn't have a camera. Uh, but I started I started taking creative writing with this really wonderful writing teacher by the name of Isabel Ziegler, and it was through her a writing class that I thought this is something I can do, and I sort of looked at my experience and started looking at my neighbors and people and wanting to write about them and express their situation. Uh, and because the movies that were being made totally distorted who we are as people.
Yeah.
And during the civil rights movement, that was one of the things we wanted to do was to correct this narrative, this false impression of who we are, since Birth of a Nation and things like that, the Searchers, all these racial films that never really respected who we were as people, you know. And so uh, one of the good things about going to UCLA in college then was the fact that there was a number of students who finally came to UCLA. It wasn't until this black contingent of students and people of color came into the department that we looked around and said, no, we should be making our films, to tell our stories and bypass a lot of this commercial influence that we have to make people laugh and distort who we are as people at the expense of, of, of people who we should be looking at as heroes instead of comic figures.
Was that was
And
that
because
was that the time of the sort of sexploitation, black exploitation? Sorry, movies. Was that before then, or very
well,
stereotypical areas for black people?
this was before black exploitation. We started, I mean, because Oscar Micheaux, this very famous black filmmaker who really invented for a while independent film, was making really wonderful films about who we are as people coming in from the South and living in New York and all these other places. And so we had that as an example of making good films. The commercial was those films that were dealing with drugs and stuff like that and violence wasn't who we were. And so we were trying to um, talk about the Harlem Renaissance, the things that happened in the South, and and to make life better and give kids an opportunity to see that we were like this whole idea of Africa becoming, we became aware of Africa. There was a history there that we were kings and stuff like that. We had created a lot of great things, that was denied. You know, like I said, when I was in school, they said, well, we couldn't do anything. We couldn't even draw. And that stayed with me for a very long time. You know, and I was very disappointed and and then you see the need for uh, education in the past and in history, Black history, and so forth. Um, because I didn't benefit from it, and I'm sure people who would have made a big difference, artists and so forth, and all writers, and no matter what, would have made a big difference if they would have knew that Phyllis Wheatley was writing at the time, that Frederick Douglass was commenting on abolitionist movements and things like that, and that there were people who were really concerned about how we lived, and
Yeah.
fought in those battles. So
So
that
how
would have made it.
so how then? So you go to UCLA. You don't know that you're a filmmaker. You know a little bit about still photography and a little bit about creative writing. Yet you make your first film, Killer of the Sheep, at UCLA. UCLA, is that right?
Yeah,
How,
as a thesis film.
yeah. How did that come about?
Well, because we were questioning um, uh, uh, content of films, and we wanted to be. We were opposed to what Hollywood was perpetuating. Who we were, and when a group of us came together, like Haile Greenwood, Julie Dash, and Sharon Larkin, Ben Caldwell, and we all met all the time, and talked about what is a black film, what should we be doing, what should our films be about, you know, and what's the need for, because everyone who weren't involved in filmmaking was doing literature or something, we were trying to we're trying to make a difference, and film as the meaning of social change became apparent, and I was one of the good things about going to UCLA because they made it clear that here's a camera, come back with something we haven't seen before. It wasn't political, but at the time, you had Jackson State, you had things that were going on in different colleges. You had, one of the things that really changed me totally overnight, like I became a man, you might say, was the Emmett Till murder, the murder of Emmett Till. When it was that was one of the most profound things that we experienced in our community. And he was killed in Mississippi, where I was from. I mean, from Chicago and killed in Mississippi in a brutal way. And this picture was in a Jet magazine, and it went throughout the neighborhood to see. Everyone had a picture of Emmett Till's brutal body being in the casket, and his mother looking at him. It was, it almost it was almost as though I stopped dreaming. I stopped having hope. It was like this, what they could do to a person, a child, you know. It was such a lasting traumatic experience. I see the picture today, you know. It never, you know, all of a sudden the sort of this innocence just evaporated like overnight. It was just a traumatic. And then following that, my brother and I went back to Mississippi uh, with via New Orleans on this integrated train, and we stopped in New Orleans. My grandmother's with us, and we were told what to do when we got to in the South, because we weren't, really, we were from there but never really experienced it, except through, you listening to stories told by my cousins in the neighborhood, storytellers and porch life conversations. And when we got to New Orleans, we saw this game room in the train station. And he and I went in this game room. We didn't realize it was full of white people and there were no black people in there. So when we went in there, we started playing these little games, and next thing we knew, the, the room was emptied, and white people were standing on the outside looking in at us. And the police were there uh, telling us we had to get out, and we had no business being in there because it's a white, privileged kind of a situation.
Yeah.
And they called my grandmother, and we had boycotted and integrated the state long before the march, the set-ins in Mississippi. And so, it took me 50 years to get over that experience.
Wow.
I hated going back to New Orleans. It took me 50 years to be able to go there and feel like kind of at ease.
Yeah. No.
And people who lived there had to do that every day. I can imagine what that was like. I mean, I from that one experience, was enough to say, no, I don't want to be a part of this one. Don't want to go back there, 50 years.
Wow.
I've gone back to speak at schools and things like that. The same way with Texas. I don't even like to go through Texas, even to this day, particularly now. Right?
Yeah.
It's like,
Yeah, it's quite hard for someone over here to understand what that is and what that feels like and how ingrained that sort of level of racism would be in those areas.
Oh, yeah. But you find it like in the film. You said it's very interesting. You bring a film. When I went to UCLA, first of all, I never told anyone in my neighborhood I was making movies, because they would say, What are you talking about? I mean, yeah, I can say I'm going to school to be a doctor, a lawyer, anything like that, because those are things that they knew about,
Yeah.
But being a filmmaker, I was kind of, I was not shamed, but embarrassed. I didn't want to argue with people about I'm being a filmmaker, because they were more correct, understanding the limitations I was putting myself in. Because when I started off, I wanted to be a cameraman,
Mm.
And in order to be a cameraman, you had to either know someone in the business, and which black people didn't. It was totally segregated, and you had to wait 15 years to get in the union to be a first cameraman. And so, but that didn't. Strange enough, I was aware of that, but I just thought I'd be making films on the weekend as a hobby,
Yeah.
and and working at a regular job, so, paying for my hobby, and so it, things changed, uh, that made it possible for independent filmmakers to make films. And it wasn't until we went to Europe, actually, black independent filmmakers went to Europe and to France and Germany and everything, and got our films in these festivals and written about, um, all over in these critical journals in Europe, where, like for example, when I won a prize at the Berlin Film Festival for Killer Sheep, and there was articles written all over in Europe about the film. When I got back to the States, there was nothing mentioned about the film winning at the Berlin Film Festival. Same thing happened with Bill Gunn and Gunn Hess. His film in Paris, and his film was a terrific audience success. The French critics walked into the airplane. That's when you can go to the gate of the airplane and go in the airplane, and then before the airplane take off, you have to get off. But you don't do that now. But then he remember, uh, had flying into New York, and nothing said. And we
Yeah.
both experienced the same thing. It was like in the early Renaissance, like Renaissance, that uh, black artists had to go to Europe to be, uh, looked at as artists, and being accepted. And that was very much the case with us at the time, and with me particularly.
Yeah.
Um,
So
I,
I often talk about the significant steps that have made you achieve what you've achieved. What were the real key things? You've talked about coming to Europe and that being a really big, significant step for you as a filmmaker. Were there any other significant steps in your career, and how did they come about?
well, I think what it was. Well, I met a lot of wonderful people at UCLA, for example, students who, we exchanged a lot of ideas, and this that that mixture really helped. But I think what it was, I mentioned Isabel Ziegler,
Mhm.
who was a writing instructor, and really introduced me to writing and stuff, and all sorts of novels. I read a lot of, and then I took up reading and novels, and wanted to be a writer in of films. But one of the things I've always wanted was to express and talk about my neighbors and the people I grew up with, and particularly the adults who worked hard in, as masonry, and as in the construction, cement mix, all, cement mixers and plasters and things like that. I used to work in the summertime with my friend and his father, uh, working in the, plastering the houses and stuff. We did all the hard work, and I used to admire these guys who would work all day long on just a bottle of whiskey, old granddad. And they would keep this mixer going, putting sand in the mixer. And sometimes I would try to do that, but I was this puny, skinny guy, that I needed I always wanted to gain weight, so I started eating a lot of potatoes and malts and all sorts of, high blood pressure food to gain weight, but I could never. But these guys I've always looked at them with these big arms, and veins running through their arms, putting the sand in that machine, just keep it going. And I used to sit back and look at it, and I said, dang, those are real men, but they were good at heart, they would come home and make sure that you had plenty to eat, and they would eat this really, pork chops and all this stuff, and things that weren't very good for you, and survive on that,
Yeah.
and there were a lot of things they did. They were, you know, I've always admired them because they sort of like we were always concerned about my well-being, and all the kids' well-being. They were always there for us in a way. And,
Yeah.
and I understood where they came from, understood the racism they experienced, understood the the, 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 the life they had in the South.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. So, so obviously a distinguished career as a filmmaker. To what degree do you think being black filmmaker over your whole career has held you back in the industry? It's still not, we'll talk a little bit more. I'm not sure how much it's changed, but to what degree do you think the color of your skin held you back in the industry?
well, I mean, it held me back. It held a lot of people, a lot of black people back. There was a lot of talented people. I knew, for example, a friend of mine, Ricky Minchin, who was a cameraman and working at Universal because they had this particular um, uh, training program at Universal and MGM and places like that, where for the look of it, they would have these integrated training programs, but they were only for you to go to one level and that was it, you know. And there's a friend of mine, Tom Pennick, who was his editor, a really great editor. He was assistant editor. He was uh, Mike Kahn's editor, and he went on to do Spielberg's movies, uh, Indiana Jones, things like that.
Right.
And he couldn't get any higher than an assistant editor training other editors, white editors, who went on to become editors. And he and Rick Robinson, whatever, stayed at that level. And they got frustrated because all these kids that they were training, white kids, went on to become accomplished and known editors and making a lot of money. And they kept staying there training these guys. And so you knew that when you went to in this business, that you had to work like 10 times as hard. And because there was some strange thing about just your color, whatever, to make them doubt that you had the ability to do anything.
Yeah.
I remember getting the job at this particular studio. This is long after, maybe things have changed a bit. And so the producers didn't want to hire me. But they were sort of like, because an actor, Delroy Lindo, wanted me to direct him in this film, that they hired me for that, but then they didn't hire him because
Huh.
they waited too long. And so when I was on set, the this lady and the producer would say, I mean, there were two producers, this lady, I forget her name, and this other guy at this company, and they would always say that, uh, first of all, we only have this amount of money, so you have to make the film with this amount of money. And it wasn't enough, but so Johnny Simmons and I said, yeah, no problem. Okay, so every day we would come and they would say, you're not going to make the day. You're not going to get through with the stuff you had to shoot, because it was more than what the budget allowed for. And every day, Johnny Simmons, the brother, we would come to work and we would do what we had to do, and we'd come on time every day. And they would ask him, how you guys do it? And because and John just helped our shoulders and said, that's what we're trained to do, and because we had to do it for less, all the time, we had to make it look 10 times better than what you paid us to do it.
Yeah.
And it was that kind of a thing. And you're teaching kids in school now, you say, particularly kids of color, you say, look, you have to learn to do this better than they had. Even though they're going to have 10 times more money than you will, you have to make it look better than their product, and make it work. And so you have, it's a little different now. Now you have people who expect black directors to do more, and a lot of the films they make, like the Black Panther, whatever it is, it what's I forget, it made like some $1 billion or something like that.
Yeah.
And now
So
they realize I've talked to, when Ozzie Davis, who tried to make films, really good films, um, and they didn't let him do it, and they just, I don't know. It's always been a struggle. Now it's a little easier.
Do you believe that it's so? If you were starting again now, do you think you would be able to achieve more than you're because it's a different environment? Because I still don't see lots and lots of black filmmakers, directors, producers. I still don't see it.
Yeah, well, the thing about it is, it's it's full of directors. A lot of directors who have a chance, but in order to make it an industry, you have to have all the means of production. Number one, and the other part of it is that you as a director, yeah, you benefit from it. But what you need to do is bring up editors. You need to bring up writers. You need to bring up all sorts of costume, hair, and stuff like that to make it an industry. Because just you working is not enough. You need the support of all these people who don't get a chance to make money like a director does. Like some directors do, and they put it that way. But you need to make sure that. I mean, I had to fight for uh, uh, my production designer. I had to fight for the post production supervisor because they were black and they had this excuse that, well, they have to work on. There's this uh, um, strange situation where they say you not only get a completion bond, you have to have people who had experience working on a Hollywood film and had a unionized film. And there was some people that I wanted to hire who had worked in my film, but not a unionized film. So the completion bond people didn't want to hire them, even though they had just as experienced. In fact, one of the ladies I wanted was Carol Monday Lawrence, who had just died recently. Had her own company in San Francisco, and I wanted to hire her as post-production supervisor. And she had did a film on Oscar Michaud on her own, an independent film, and knew more about the film than me and the producers because she had been in it a long business, but they didn't want to hire her because she was a minority. And then when I wanted to hire her and insist on hire her, the producer said, "Oh, Charles only want to hire black people." No, I wanted to hire people who had experience, who needed an opportunity. And so and Ricky mentioned who had worked at Universal uh, as a camera trainee person. He couldn't get a job. A guy who got one of my film who had just got out of film school did had years of experience because he had was easy for him to get a job early and continue to develop. And so, and Johnny and Ricky mentioned, I saw him one day and I said, well, what happened? You haven't seen him. He said, this is as far as I go. I can't, they won't hire me. He had more experience than a lot of these people that went on and did successful films and so forth because of his color. And so, I
So,
mean,
so
but hopefully those days are over, to a large extent.
like that brings me on to that question. If those days over? I mean, we talk a lot about what we call institutional racism, where people of color just can't get jobs or are treated differently to people of equivalent skills. Whether that's low, medium, or high, they're always down. To what degree do you think that still exists? And if it does exist in your industry in Hollywood, how can it be changed?
Well, it exists in the different forms. I mean, and in different forms in the sense that um, a lot of people of color are hired because they can get them for less, and so they don't make as much money. Like Monique and several people have complained about how they were asked to to be in a film, a studio film, and then offer a job, but only if they could take it for less, And so they were upset about it. They, they their argument was, look, I have the same bills that everyone else has the same bill,
Hmm.
and I don't see why I have to get paid less because of my color, And I have to accept it. I have to feel obligated and feel that I owe this film because it's a black film, and I have to give up, you know, what I've been trained for, is make a living off of this. And I know like a friend of mine, it's Santiago who has his own company. He can't get a job now. A lot of people can't. And a lot of people who go off teaching now, rather than trying to insist on, you know, trying to find a job as is, because if you don't, you know, you have debt that it doesn't that debt is colorblind, in a
Yes.
sense. You have to pay the pauper, and so uh, yeah, I know a lot of people who have these medical bills that's the stuff that kills you, and they have to go on. Look, my plumber makes more money than I do. You know, he comes and I have a stopped up sink. He'll come and look at it. 30 minutes. I mean, like 5 minutes. He puts the thing down a plunger and then sucks it out, and then he hands me a bill. You know, and it's like, hey man, I need to come work with you sometime, because it is a consistent work. That's the thing. It's been like, I forget how many years, almost 10 years since I've done a feature film, and so it's not as lucrative as one thinks, and then unless you, are very good and looked at it as a business. I never looked at it as a business, you know.
Yeah.
And so I think my attitude has been probably working against me in many ways. And then if you want to do something about the Black experience, that's where the hangup comes in, because it's like they look at you like, well, it's hard to get distribution, it's hard to get financing, where's it going to be marketed and things like that. They give you all these excuses why they don't want to make those kinds of films.
Yeah.
Those are the kind of films you're interested in. You're not interested. I'm not really interested in entertaining people, making them laugh. It's just it's just too much money involved. Because it takes a lot of money. Uh, my experience was that when I did Killer Sheep, I had uh, got a grant from UCLA, a Louis B. Mayer grant, only a couple of $1,000, and the kid in my neighborhood uh, wanted to borrow some money from me, and I had only enough money to make the film. And it was the sleeper thing, a sleeper thing. No, it was a Killer Sheep.
Yeah.
And so I didn't loan him the money. And I felt really bad about it. And he wanted to borrow some money because he wanted to get out of town,
Yeah.
And so I didn't, find every kind of excuse not to give, because I said, well, I got to make this movie. And it was a grant given to me. Okay. Then unfortunately, what hurt real bad is that the guy died later on. He was killed. And so I really felt sorry that the money could have been, maybe saved his life in many ways, and changed things for him, And so
Yeah.
I've always had films had to be worth something,
Yeah.
And one of the things that happened that sort of redeemed and it happened over several times, was some people who've seen the film and seen some of my films came up to me and says, your film changed my life, and it did this and that. And that was the thing that really helped, saying that, I think I did the right thing
Yeah.
in a way. It was a
Yeah.
tragic kind of thing, but those are the kind of considerations you have to deal with, is a film worth, you look at these films that cost $1 billion now, four or $500,000. I mean, $1 million, and and you see all this poverty on the street. You have to really be aware of what you can do with that. With that money, is it worth it? Are you making a dent?
Yeah. The cost of filmmaking at the moment is literally ridiculous for some films. And so less low budget films are being made, and lots of these big budget films are being made, and not some instances not enough people are watching them, because the cinema is not what it was, not the medium that it was. So how can it be different? Looking forward, I know we're sort of running short of time, so a couple of last questions. One, One, how can you see the industry changing to make it more accessible for people of color to be successful?
Well, I'll tell you one of the things that we were lucky to be a part of. There were several people who helped to um, screen films in the community. Pearl Bowser, who did a film on I think as well as Oscar Michaud. Um, Oliver Franklin, Pearl Bowser in New York. She isn't feeling very well right now, but and there was Oliver Franklin in to Philadelphia, who had put on a tour of Black independent films. As soon as more students, Black people, got involved in filmmaking in college at an early stage, that they had produced a number of films that can be considered, you know, a library of films, an archive, and also the fact that what really helped to bring up this foreign uh, uh, distributing of films, and showing films at these festivals really help this Black independent filmmakers find a home and a way to communicate. Not to communicate so much, but to show their film at these art houses in these foreign countries. Like in London, what's that, Black Audio and stuff like that,
Hmm.
and we made contact with a lot of people there that had in Channel 4 of England, Derek Hill, I remember him. Uh, they were very instrumental in helping to promote Black independent films, London and abroad. So that, I mean, those kinds of things help. But one of the things that Pearl Bowser and Oliver Franklin did, we showed these films throughout the states, and we had these conversations with local people in the community, which was very needed and necessary because it wasn't just like screening in the studio and there was no response and we didn't know what people wanted. These people told us what they liked and didn't like, and we helped. And so that little introduction to these people in the neighborhood helped to develop a fan club base, and understanding what was needed and an audience for these films. So, because they put on screenings after that, put on individuals who took up the distribution, had their own little community screenings, so that really helped to tell us that you're doing this right or you're doing this wrong. I don't understand it, whatever it is. So we got a sense of what people liked, where we should be going. And that was very important because, when you do a major film, you don't hear what people, you hear the critics talk about, oh, it made so much money and this and that, but not what the public says,
Yeah.
you know, how we got them to move uh, and, and respond. And so that was really important.
So thanks for that. So we're running out of time. So my last question is, given everything that's happening, especially in the States, with the election,
Ah,
last week, and even the amount of Black people who voted for Trump, is there
ah,
a reason that we should be hopeful for the future?
I mean, I'm sorry. That last week put me in such a state of stress and distress. I mean, all my friends who voted thought the way I did, really suffering through this, trying to get over it. You know, it's just it was a nightmare. We had a chance to. It was like doing something so positive
Yeah.
and changing the course of this. I mean, one of the things they never did do was deal with the racism in this country. I mean, it was clear in many ways what was going to go in certain ways in this election because I did the research on Nat Turner and stuff like that, and I talked to a lot of people, white people in the South and all over the place, and I found that there is this discrepancy that they haven't really. People still fighting the Civil War. I mean,
Yeah.
they still think that you know that the South was cheated out of you know. I mean, that they shouldn't have won the war. There was a just cause and all this kind of stuff. They still believe it. If you go there and talk about, Nat Turner, and what Nat Turner meant. They're still fighting the war. You can't, if you go to Georgia, Savannah, Georgia, and mention Sherman, who who was a Union officer, a general who was supposedly had burnt down Atlanta to the sea or the ocean, whatever it is. They still, I mean, you can't even mention his name without starting to fight. You know, and Nat Turner is the same way. I mean, and the relatives of Nat Turner are still living in Virginia. They're still feeling threats from the white people because they haven't gotten over it yet. You
Wow.
know, the Nat Turner revolt, revolution. It's and you know, they still think that we shouldn't be a part of this country.
Yeah. But I think that's true. So what can we do? You know, someone that's lived from the lived civil rights through to where we are now and the disaster we had last week, what can be done?
You 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 still have to fight and struggle. I mean, there were people who went through this. You know, we talked about there's so many black people who um, should be known, and if you know this present administration gets their way, that all it can be erased and forgotten about it. Like they were trying to ban books, they're trying to ban, you know, in colleges, Black history and all of that stuff. You know, and you can't. We have to fight for that. We have to have these little meetings where we teach our kids that you know that there were these heroes. Like if I had known all those wonderful people that stood up during slavery, you know, and contributed in spite of everything, because their struggles is the reason why I'm here and all the black people in this country are surviving. You know, I got them to think every time I wake up. You know, not every time, but quite often, because look, I'm claustrophobic, and I can't see myself being on a slave ship. Like when you see these pictures of these guys being like packed in like sardines going across the middle passage. Yeah, no, I couldn't survive that. But a distant relative of mine did, and those people, I just take my hat off and say, you know, right, you know, I don't know how you did it because I couldn't have done it. There's a lot of things I wouldn't have tolerated, maybe because of my present attitude and being informed differently. But no, man, this no.
Yeah.
No.
So what I'm getting from that as a last word is we need to keep fighting. We need to keep fighting, and that it's kind of like a nice bookend to this podcast, which is, you know, going back to where you started and what it was like to now. There's been a lot has changed, but still stuff remains the same.
Yeah.
You know, which is great. Look, Charles, thank you very much. We at a time. It's an absolute pleasure to hear your story, and how you've grown up and the struggles and the industry. Incredible insight. So I'm incredibly grateful to you for taking the time to talk to me, and to our listeners. It's been an honor, and I thank you very much.